Circle 8.
Circle 8.
Circle 8.
Welcome to Circle 8. Humanistic Psychology. Excerpts from Three Psychologies, Robert D. Nye, Brooks Cole Publishing Company, 1981. Basic Nature. Rogers' theory of personality as humanistic phenomenology calls attention to his respect for human beings as individuals who have, at their most basic nature, a tendency to strive for growth and fulfillment, and who must be understood in terms of their particular conceptualizations of reality. Rogers is fundamentally an optimist about human potential. He feels that if people are freed from restricting, corrupting social influences, they can achieve a higher level of personal and interpersonal functioning and can avoid the reality distortions that prevent the achievement of ever greater growth and fulfillment. Actualization. The actualizing tendency. According to Rogers, the actualizing tendency is the single basic human motive he believes that the human organism inherently tends to maintain itself and to strive for enhancement. And this is what he means by actualization. The phrase growth and fulfillment refers to the major aspects of actualization and in a general sense can be considered as synonymous with that term. However, actualization also includes maintenance of the organism. In Rogers' view, we are set at birth to grow productively towards fulfillment. We are basically active and forward-moving, and if conditions are favorable, we will attempt to develop our potentialities to their maximum. The specifics of human growth vary from person to person. In other words, not everyone will do exactly the same thing when conditions are proper for actualization. To illustrate, one individual may choose to become intensely involved in family life and the nurturance of children, striving to heighten his or her experiences within that context, whereas another person may be heavily involved increasing his or her professional competence and in developing meaningful non-marital relationships. Rogers suggests that there is no need to assume separate motives for these different behaviors. It is sufficient to posit one primary motive, the actualizing tendency, and then to go on and study the conditions under which actualization occurs, whatever this involves in terms of specific behaviors. Although actualization differs from one person to person, with regard to specifics, there are still some generalizations that apply. Some common characteristics resulting from actualization process are flexibility rather than rigidity, openness rather than defensiveness, and autonomy, increased freedom from external control, rather than heteronomy. Rogers' concept of the actualizing tendency applies to the organism as a whole. This tendency is the only central source of energy, and it mobilizes the entire organism toward maintenance and enhancement. The healthy human organism is moved towards greater and greater growth in its capabilities as a result of actualizing tendency. If conditions exist that are conducive to this growth, Rogers stresses that individuals need to experience unconditional acceptance from other persons who are significant in their lives. The self and self-actualization. The notion of self or self-concept is so important in Rogers' psychology that his theory is often referred to as a self theory. The self is an outgrowth of certain aspects of individual experiencing. The newborn infant is an organism whose inner experiencing, also referred to as the phenomenal field or subjective world, is a relatively undifferentiated totality of sensations and perceptions that constitute his or her reality. As the actualizing tendency moves the infants towards maintenance and enhancement of experience potentialities, interaction occurs with significant other persons. For example, the mother and father. As this happens, part of the infant's organismic experiencing differentiates into a self or self-concept. Certain sensations and perceptions become discriminated as I, me, myself, or being related to I, me, myself. These are self experiences. Rogers pointed out that there is a tendency for the self to be a fluid, changing totality, but at any given time it has certain properties that can be at least partially measured objectively by any psychological test. As the self is portrayed here, it is a special part of the individual's total organismic experiencing. The person may not be fully aware at any given time of all his or her experiencing that constitutes or relates to the self, but such awareness is a possibility. Rogers believes that humans have the potential to be constructively aware of their total experiencing, but to do so requires openness and responsiveness to this experiencing. This may or may not be encouraged by significant others, such as parents during childhood and marriage partners, or close friends during adulthood. As the self or self concept develops, the actualizing tendency operates to actualize this emerging portion of the organism. Rogers refers to this as the tendency towards self-actualization. The self-actualizing tendency can be considered as a subsystem of the more basic actualizing tendency. Remember, the actualizing tendency is the basic underlying organismic motive. The development of the self is an outgrowth of the general tendency towards maintenance and enhancement of the organism. As this self is forming, some of the actualizing tendency expresses itself in self-actualization. A basic assumption in Rogerian psychology is that the organism, which can be considered as the locus of all experiencing, is a more technical term than human being, has an actualizing tendency as its single basic underlying motive. The actualizing tendency serves to maintain and enhance the organism's experiences and potentialities. That is, it encourages actualization. An outcome of the growth and elaboration of the organism is development of a self or self-concept. Some of the actualizing tendency becomes invested in the expansion and in fulfillment of the self or self-concept. And this subsystem of the actualizing tendency is referred to as the self-actualizing tendency. The organismic valuing process. The organismic valuing process is a concept that can be considered as supplemental to the notion of the actualizing tendency. It describes a process associated with the actualization and helps to explain in more detail the positive direction of organismic growth. We started out in life knowing that we like and dislike, generally speaking, what is good for us. In the infant stage, the valuing process is ongoing and flexible and operates smoothly. The criterion for whether something is positively or negatively valued rests on whether it is maintained and or enhances the organism and, once developed, the self. The valuing process at this early period of life functions spontaneously without preconceived judgments or concern and detailed thought. Rogers believed strongly that we would all be better off if we're able to retain this kind of functioning, that is, if the organismic valuing process could continue to operate smoothly and with flexibility. This evaluating process occurs within the individual and is intimately tied to inner experiences of desirability or undesirability for the individual. The unconditional positive regard. When the self develops, the individual wants love and acceptance. There is a need for positive regard from others. Rogers has suggested that this need for love and affection is innate. Because of this need, certain other persons in a child's life, later in the adult's life, assume great importance. Early in life, then, we learn to view ourselves as others view us. We come to like or dislike our total configuration of self-experiences independently of the immediate presence of our parents or significant persons. In other words, we incorporate within ourselves a set of values that initially was applied externally. The internalization of these values of significant others results in the alienation from our own organismic valuing process. The introjected values of others, which we come to live by to greater or lesser extent, generally tends to be rigid and unchanging, in contrast to the flexibility and changing values of the organismic valuing process operating in early infancy. Rogers has suggested a number of introjected values that are often learned in the home, at school, in church, from the government, and so on. These values may be out of line with organismic experiencing, but they are often accepted in order to have the positive regard of significant other persons. Number 1, sexuality is bad. Number 2, unquestioning obedience to authority is good. Number 3, making money is very important. Number 4, scholarly learning is good. Number 5, unstructured, aimless learning is a waste of time. Number 6, communism is totally bad. Other examples might be the common beliefs that it is improper for men to cry or hug each other, for women to be independent or assertive. An important point is that the person's self-regard, one's view of one's own worth, is determined by these interjected values. As Rogers indicates, the individual becomes, in a sense, his own significant social other. The thoughts, feelings, and actions approved by the significant others, and eventually approved by individuals themselves in order to maintain positive regard and self-regard, may be so different from experiences approved by the other person's own organismic valuing process that an almost complete dissociation develops between his or her self-concept and his or her most basic fundamental inner experiencing. This situation is very unhealthy and causes the person to function in a restricted and inefficient way and to experience tension and anxiety. Unconditional positive regard is received when a person perceives that all of his or her self-experiences, feelings, thoughts, sensations, and so on, are equally worth of positive regard from significant others. Unconditional positive regard is given when all of the self-experiences of another person are valued equally. In other words, no conditions of worth are imposed on that individual. Rogers suggests that the terms acceptance and prizing are generally synonymous with the term unconditional positive regard. If another person is accepted or prized, that the person is valued unconditionally, he or she is allowed awareness of the full range of inner experiencing and does not gain and maintain positive regard from others. As will be made clear when client-centered therapy is discussed, unconditional positive regard is essential for a therapeutic relationship. The therapist relates on a person-to-person basis and must feel that the client is worthy of respect regardless of the client's feelings or behaviors. Clients must be accepted for what they are without reservations. They can begin to drop their defenses against or denial of self-experiences that have been disowned because of previous exposure to conditional rather than unconditional positive regard. Rogers' observations and studies of the positive changes that occurred during the course of client-centered therapy have supported his belief in the effectiveness of unconditional positive regard. Congruence and incongruence. Congruence is a state of consistency or harmony. Incongruence is a state of discrepancy or disharmony. The concepts of congruence and incongruence in Rogers' theory grew out of his therapeutic experiences as he observed clients struggling to revise their self-concepts in the direction of greater consistency with organismic experiencing. In other words, the clients were moving from a state of incongruence between their self-concepts and their basic inner organismic experiences and towards a state of increased congruence between these aspects of themselves. Rogers suggests that the terms integrated, whole, and genuine can be considered synonymous with congruent. A major goal of client-centered therapy is to allow the client to achieve a congruent state. The fully functioning person. The concept of fully functioning person is ideal. According to Rogers, This hypothetical individual would represent the ultimate actualization of the human organism. Such a person would have experienced unconditional positive regard from the significant others in his life. No conditions of worth would exist, and therefore the individual would experience unconditional self regard. In actuality, no one has achieved this absolute state. People in real life are fully functioning in relative terms, some more, some less. Also, Rogers points out that it is best to conceive of full functioning as a process rather than a static condition. A person who is functioning effectively and well is an adaptive organism, changing to meet the new situations in the most satisfying ways and moving towards higher and higher levels of actualization. So even though the term fully functioning can be used in hypothetical sense to refer to the ultimate in human development, it should be realized that Rogers is most concerned with the process of actualization. In a practical sense, a fully functioning person is one who is able to move constructively in the direction of ever increasing growth and fulfillment. Rogers considered the ideal, fully functioning person to be in a state of congruence. No disharmony exists between the self and the organismic experiencing. Such a person is open to and is accurately aware of his experiencing and does not defend against or distort experiences. The fully functioning person effectively tests reality in order to maximize satisfaction rather than making do with unsatisfying life conditions. Also, and very importantly, to be fully functioning is to be able to carry on relationships with others in harmonious ways. Client-centered theory. Client-centered, now frequently referred to as person-centered counseling, is another historically significant and influential theory. This theory was originally developed and described by Carl Rogers as a reaction against what he considers the basic limitations of psychoanalysis. As a result of his influence, this particular approach is often referred to as Rogerian counseling. This person-centered approach focuses on the client's responsibility and capacity to discover more appropriate behaviors for themselves. The person-centered approach emphasizes the phenomenal world of the client, with accurate empathy and attempt to apprehend the client's perception of self and of the world. Rogers proposed the hypothesis that certain attitudes on the therapist's part, genuineness, non-possessive warmth and acceptance, and accurate empathy, constitutes the necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic effectiveness. Person-centered theory holds that the therapist is to be immediately present and accessible to the client and to focus on the here and now experience created by their relationship. Corey, 1982. In understanding the client or person-centered approach to counseling, it's helpful to be aware of the personality basis for this theory, as presented by Rogers, 1953, in the form of 19 propositions. The lead statements for each of these propositions are: 1. Every individual exists in a continually changing world of experience, of which he is the center. 2. The organism reacts to the field as it is experienced and perceived. This perceptual field is, for the individual, reality. 3. The organism reacts as an organized whole to the phenomenal field. 4. The organism has one basic tendency and striving: to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. 5. Behavior is basically the goal-directed attempt to the organism to satisfy its needs as experienced in the field as perceived. 6. Emotion accompanies and in general facilitates such goal-directed behavior, the kind of emotion being related to the seeking versus the consummatory aspects of the behavior, and the intensity of the emotion being related to the perceived significance of the behavior for the maintenance and enhancement of the organism. 7. The best vantage point for understanding behavior is from the internal frame of reference of the individual himself. 8. A portion of the total perception of field gradually becomes differentiated as the self. 9. As a result of interaction with the environment, and particularly as a result of evaluational interaction with others, the structure of self is formed and organized, fluid but consistent. Conceptual patterns of perception of characteristics and relationships of the I or the me, together with values attached to these concepts. 10. The values attached to experiences and the values which are a part of self-structure, in some instances, are values experienced directly by the organism, and in some instances are values interjected or taken over from others but perceived in distorted fashion as if they had been experienced directly. 11. As experiences occur in the life of the individual, they are either A. Symbolized, perceived, and organized into relationships to the self, B. Ignored because there is no perceived relationship to self-structure, and C. Denied symbolization because the experience is inconsistent with the structure of the self. 12. Most of the ways of behaving which are adopted by the organism are those which are consistent with the concept of self. 13. Behavior may, in some instances, be brought about by organic experiences and needs which have not been symbolized. Such behaviors may be inconsistent with the structure of the self, but in such instances, the behavior is not owned by the individual. 14. Psychological maladjustment exists when the organism denies to awareness significant sensory and visceral experiences, which consequently are not symbolized and organized into the gestalt of the self-structure. When this situation exists, there is a basic or potential psychological tension. 15. Psychological adjustment exists when the concept of the self is such that all the sensory and visceral experiences of the organism or may be assimilated on a symbolic level into a consistent relationship with the concept of self. 16. Any experience which is inconsistent with the organization or structure of self may be perceived as a threat, and the more of these perceptions there are, the more rigidly the self-structure is organized to maintain self. 17. Under certain conditions, involving primarily complete absence of any threat to the self-structure, experiences which are inconsistent with it may be perceived and examined, and the structure of self revised to assimilate and include such experience. 18. When the individual perceives and accepts into one consistent and integrated system all of his sensory and visceral experiences, then he is necessarily one more understanding of others and is more accepting of others as separate individuals. 19. As the individual perceives and accepts into his self-structure more of his organic experiences, he finds that he is replacing his present value system based so largely upon interjections which have been distortedly symbolized with a continuing organismic valuing process. In the counseling relationship, 6 conditions account for the personality change in the client. They were presented by Rogers, 1959A, 1967. 1. 2 people, a therapist and a client, are in a psychological contract, 1967. 2. The client is experiencing a state of anxiety, distress, or incongruence. Number 3. The therapist is genuine, truly himself or herself in relating to the client. Number 4. The therapist feels or exhibits unconditional positive regard for the client. Number 5. The therapist exhibits emphatic understanding of the client's frame of reference and conveys this understanding to the client. Number 6. The therapist succeeds to a minimum degree in communicating emphatic understanding and unconditional positive regard to the client. 1959A. Some of the changes expected to form a successful utilization of this approach are: the person comes to see himself differently, He accepts himself and his feelings more fully. He becomes more self-confident and self-directing. He becomes more the person he would like to be. He becomes more flexible, less rigid in his perceptions. He adopts more realistic goals for himself. He behaves in a more mature fashion. He changes his maladjusted behavior, even such a long established one as chronic alcoholism. He becomes more acceptant of others. He becomes more open to the evidence, both to what is going on outside of himself and to what is going on inside of himself. He changes in his basic personality characteristics in constructive ways. 1959. Thus, the client centered model is optimistic, positive in its views of humankind. Clients are viewed as being basically good and possessing the capabilities for self understanding, insight, problem solving, decision making, change, and growth. The counselor's role is that of a facilitator and reflector. The counselor facilitates a counselee's self understanding and clarifies and reflects back to the client the expressed feelings and attitudes of the client. Information giving for a problem solving in a client centered counselor also would not seek to direct the mediation of the counselee's inner world, but rather would seek to provide a climate in which the counselee could bring about change in himself or herself. In recent years, another label for self theory has been increasingly used instead of the traditional client centered, non directive, or Rogerian labels. This has probably resulted from the emphasis on enhancement of the self, the capacity of oneself, self-actualization, and self-perception. Regardless of one's choice of label, this theory originated by Rogers continues to exert its influence on the field of counseling.